Chapter 4, From Cells to Organ Systems, Screencast 1. So what we're doing now is actually moving on to larger levels of organization. So kind of remember where we're coming from. We started off at the chemistry level, so atoms and molecules, focusing on those biological molecules especially. And then we moved on to the cell and how the cell generates energy, organelles, and those things. So now we're moving up on the spectrum, and we're talking about multicellular organisms. So these are going to be made up of multiple cells. So when we have organisms that are made up of lots of cells, those cells in some situations are going to have specialized functions. It's not just going to be like that diagram of a generic animal cell. Now, groups of cells with a common function are called tissues. So one thing that we're going to introduce in this chapter are the primary tissue types, and there are 4 of them. Then those tissues group together and we have organs, and then organ systems with each performing one or more complex functions that are necessary to maintain homeostasis in that organism. And then a big one is that concept of homeostasis. And homeostasis is a consistent internal environment. So things that we regulate like body temperature, pH, things like that, and how the body goes about doing that. We'll also introduce different types of different types of feedback mechanisms. And right off the bat, I want you to understand that a negative feedback mechanism is going to be homeostatic. So once again, negative feedback mechanisms are homeostatic in nature. Now, there are 4 primary tissue types: epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissues. So the next thing we're going to do is kind of talk about what these tissues are, their roles, and so on. Now, when we look at epithelial tissues, one of the things that I want you to kind of remember here is they're very cellular. So if you're looking at a slide of an epithelial tissue and you see lots and lots of cells closely packed together, chances are you've got an epithelial. Also, they're lining cavities and body surfaces. So that's another really important. There's always going to be what we refer to as free space. Then we have various glands in the body that are made up of epithelial tissue also. And there's 2 types of glands in general. We have exocrine glands, and those secrete products into a hollow organ or duct. Then we have endocrine glands, and they are actually secreting hormones, and those hormones are released into the blood, and they're widely distributed throughout the body. Okay, so adrenaline or epinephrine is a really good example of a hormone. If we look at an exocrine secretion, a really good example is going to be sweat, oil, those types of things. Now here, when we look at how we classify epithelial tissues, there's 2 levels of classification. One is on shape, and the other is going to be on layers. So when you see a flat cell, and that's a liner, that's squamous. So when you did the cheek cell activity, if you took the lab last week, that's really what you were looking at. You're looking at these squamous cells. Then there's cuboidal, so the shape here is pretty self-explanatory. And we find cuboidal tissue lining tubules, especially within the kidney. That's a really good example where you're going to find cuboidal tissue. Columnar, that's column-shaped, and we're going to find that lining the respiratory tract, the digestive tract, and the reproductive tract. So once again, those are places where you can expect to find epithelial tissue. Now, the other way is layers, okay? So we can take a look back over here. And so I can have a single layer, okay, as noted here. So these are simple overall. And then we can have stratified. So now as I add layers, so the outer layer of the skin is a really, really good example, I now have a protective benefit. I'm not going to get a protective benefit from a single layer. So that's a covering, or it's going to be releasing some type of a secretion. So I kind of want you to keep that in mind. So one of the things you should be able to do is identify where you would expect to find these tissues. So as I said, if we look at simple or single layered, so that's really about transport, making it easier for something to diffuse across the cell membrane. So something like the respiratory system, where we're doing gas exchange, that's going to be a good example. And as I indicated before, you're going to find stratified or multiple layered epithelial tissue in those areas especially exposed to some type of mechanical stress. So they provide protection, and a really good example is in the skin. Now, I want you to kind of think about the basement membrane, okay? And what this is a non-cellular layer that's directly beneath epithelial tissue. Now, if you've ever done flooring, think of this as the subfloor, all right? Or if you're laying down carpet, this is going to be that foam layer underneath the carpet. That's a really good example that you can kind of think of as the basement membrane. And so really what's happening here, that's providing support and helping to hold, okay, the cells together that are on top of this basement membrane, okay? And so it's an attachment, okay? So it's also going to attach the epithelial layer to tissues that are underneath, okay? So that's generally what we're going to see. Now, another term that you'll hear is apical surface. That's the free surface, okay? So I just wanted to introduce that term so that you understand what that is. Now, when we look at different ways cells are held together, so these are cells next to each other, there's three general types of junctions. So we have tight junctions, adhesion junctions or desmosomes, and gap junctions. Now, when we look at tight junctions, I don't want you to think of as a perfect junction. So things can still move through the connection, okay? So this is relatively tight, like plasma membrane cells held together, but still there is some degree of space for things to move through. That's important. Now, when we look at desmosomes, I like calling that like cellular Velcro. Okay, Velcro is a flexible tightener, right? And so there's some movement, but it allows the tissue to stretch. So the skin is a really good example, but also if we look at the heart, okay, when the heart contracts, right, the force is being generated from multiple directions. So the desmosomes that are found holding cardiac muscle cells together help hold those cells together as the heart is pumping. And then I have gap junctions, and these are protein channels, and specifically we're going to find these in areas where there is a lot of coordination. If I look at heart cells, if I look at smooth muscle cells of the digestive system, cells that contract in an orderly, coordinated manner. Because what's happening here is we're going to see ions are moving through these gap channels. And when ions move, that's how we actually look at the flow of electrical activity in organisms. And that's going to be the next chapter when we move on to chapter 11. Now, the next type of tissue are connective tissues. This is a relatively wide range of various tissues within the body. And so a lot of general functions here. So support is going to be one, okay, providing protection to the softer organs of the body. Implied in the name of connective tissue, connecting parts of the body together. We're going to be storing fat, producing blood cells. So a whole bunch of different types of functions are going to be devoted to connective tissue. Now, when we talked about epithelial tissue, the discriminating factor there was very, very cellular. That's not the case in connective tissue. So you're going to have a matrix and cells suspended in that matrix. And there's also going to be fibers and things like that. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, when we describe connective tissues, there's two general types. They're fibrous and specialized. So let's take a look at them now. Now, fibrous connective tissues, so that's going to provide strength and elasticity. The fibers that you're going to see are going to be collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Now, these fibers are embedded in what we refer to as a ground substance or matrix, and it's gel-like, okay? And that matrix, basically, it's between the cells making up the connective tissue, and it's the matrix that is really giving connective tissue its characteristics. Now, the cells that you can expect to find in connective tissue are going to be fibroblasts. So those are going to be producing fibers. Macrophages and lymphocytes and neutrophils, and those are immune cells. They're associated with an immune function. Okay, so those are some things you want to keep in mind with regards to fibrous connective tissue. Now, if we look at the different types of fibrous connective tissue, there's loose. So that's surrounding internal organs, muscles, and blood vessels. It's kind of like a protective packaging, okay? There's dense connective tissue, and that's going to be responsible for our tendons and ligaments, and maybe some of those deeper layers of our skin. We have elastic, so that's going to be surrounding hollow organs. And that actually, especially those organs that have to hold things and change shape because they're holding things. So the stomach and the bladder are really good examples where we're going to find elastic connective tissue. And then there's reticular, and this is actually making up an internal framework of soft organs. And so here we can see a lot of the different fibers that you would expect to find in fibrous connective tissue. Now, if we look at specialized, okay, and so the examples that we have primarily are cartilage, bone, blood, and adipose tissue. Now, cartilage is actually a transitional tissue because what happens basically is some types of cartilage, hyaline cartilage in particular, is going to go through an ossification process. So it basically develops into bone. And what cartilage basically does, it helps kind of shape certain body parts, and we find in various areas. Here, this is hyaline cartilage, okay? I think it's really pretty, and I call it bubular cartilage because you see these little bubbles that are kind of embedded in that matrix. Here is adipose tissue, so I can actually see an adipocyte, and so a globule of fat basically found in that cell. So those are things that we look at. Now, bone and blood are also considered to be connective tissue. So bone is forming the skeleton, so we have bones connecting to each other. And if we look at blood, that's kind of the ultimate connective tissue as that's connecting the entire body together. And so if we look at blood, there's a fluid matrix, which is plasma, with cells or formed elements, so red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets suspended in that fluid matrix of plasma. And then, as I said, we have adipose tissue, and those are our fat cells, and that plays a role in energy storage and actually insulating our body. Okay, so then we're going to move on to muscle tissue. And there's actually three types of muscle. Skeletal muscle, and that is what we consider to be voluntary. That's moving our body parts. So that plays a role in locomotion, lifting things, moving things. All of those things are related to skeletal muscle. We basically call it striated. And we also will use the term voluntary to describe it because we control how that kind of works. Then we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac is also striated, but that's where it's limited to heart tissue, and it contracts, it generates force. We'll talk a lot more about that when we move to the heart chapter. But this is involuntary, and it only has a single nucleus. And whereas look at skeletal muscle, even though it's striated, each cell, okay, has lots of nuclei. So we call that multinucleated. And then I have smooth muscle. This is kind of spindle shaped, and this is the muscle that's surrounding hollow organs. So the stomach, the digestive system, the reproductive tract, our blood vessels. Those are all different types of smooth muscle, and that is also considered to be involuntary. And then you're going to find a single nucleus. It's spindle shaped, as I said before. Now, nervous tissue is specialized, and there's two different types. We have the neurons, and those are actually the cells that are responsible in communication. So they're going to be generating and transmitting electrical impulses. And the primary components of a neuron are going to be the cell body, dendrites, and the axon. We'll talk about this quite a bit when we move on to chapter 11. Then most of the cells that you find in nervous tissue are glial cells. So this is the support system to neurons. So they're going to be all around those neurons. They're going to provide protection, and they're also going to be providing nutrients to the neurons themselves.